Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another edition of the African Epistemology's Advanced Seminar Series. Before continuing, please make sure that you rename yourself, including your name, surname, and institution, preferably, to avoid being kicked out of the meetings by colleagues. This is a security measure to avoid any Zoom bombing. In addition, please note that this seminar is being recorded and live streamed, and all participants tacitly consent by remaining in the seminar. My name is Olerato Mokumudzi. I am currently a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Cape Town and a doctoral fellow at HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa. On behalf of the director of HUMA, Dr. Divine Fa, and the convener of the seminar series, Dr. Sanya Osha, we would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us from whichever part of the world you're residing in. At HUMA, we organize several seminar series, which may also be of interest to you, including the Publishing Africa Seminar Series, Attire Seminar Series, the Ethical Humanitarianism Series, the Doctoral Seminar Series, and the Book Launch Seminar. You can, of course, retrieve all of the details on these seminars on our website at www.huma.uct.ac.za. In today's African Epistemology's Advanced Seminar Series, we are joined by Dr. Serawit Debele. Dr. Serawit is a junior research group leader at the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence based at the University of Beirut, Germany. She leads the project titled Sexualities, Political Orders and Revolutions in Africa into the Heart of Tunisia, Ethiopia, and Sudan. She holds a PhD from the University of Beirut in religious studies and is the author of a book titled Locating Politics in Ethiopia's Eritrea Ritual. In today's seminar, Dr. Debele will be discussing with us a tribute to collective mothering as an everyday practice of freedom. Thank you so much, Dr. Debele, for joining us. The floor is yours, of course, and after you've presented, we will then open the floor for any discussion, questions, or comments. You can go ahead, Doctor. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the invitation. And I don't know if it's a discussion on collective mothering. It's more reflection and like Thanksgiving, perhaps. And I think this talk comes at the right time for me because of my own experience with motherhood. And yeah, thank you very much. I'm so grateful. I'm going to read and I'm going to look up because I'm looking at a different screen. I'm going to look up when I read, and if that creates any inconvenience, I apologize. And yeah, off we go. So this talk comes at a time when my brother and I are 2 weeks away from organizing the 7th year memorial service for my mother, who transitioned in October 2014. My brother is in charge of the church services. Since the 7th year is a big deal, I was gutted not to have been in Ethiopia to be part of the procession. I think that's settled now. Thanks to HUMA, I was told it's HUMA. It created another way of remembering her and the other women central to my social and intellectual formation. Two overlapping categories of women keep me grounded in my musings today. On one end are my biological mother, Fantayol de Mikael, and other mothers such as Adawain Haile Selassie, Bizunesh Mamu, Tasamash Nigatu, Hadabajiga, Hadatakasta, and Asagadesh Kudata. On the other are Black women thinkers whose work helped me think through mothers, and these are Nkirun Zegu, Ife Amadiume, Mata Kwe Kumsa, Obioma Nimeka, Sadia Hartman, Patricia Hill-Collins, and Audre Lorde. Citing examples from West Africa, Audre Lorde writes, I quote, "Black women have always bonded together in support of each other. They do so, however, uneasily and in the face of whatever other allegiances which militated against that bonding. We've banded together with each other for wisdom and strength and support, end of quote. Now, I think collective mothering is one such site of bonding for wisdom, strength, and support. To make my case, I draw on my own formation as a daughter of several mothers who, for my sake, imagined opportunities that they did not have for themselves. Let me share the story of how I got here because of the women who worked on me. My hometown, it's called Debele, for those who know Ethiopia, did not have a high school when I came of age in the 1990s. There was one high school 10 kilometers away and another one 25 kilometers far from my home. Fantai, my biological mother, could have sent me to either, but letting me stay alone in a rented house or allowing me to commute was not in my best interest. Her reasoning was that it is both unsafe and unproductive. Unsafe because she's letting a teenager live alone unprotected. Unproductive because I will have been tired at the end of the school day if I had to commute and there will not be enough time to study. These were considerations that she couldn't overlook. Now my mother had to make a decision to hand me over to another mother who lived in Addis Ababa so I can go to a better school. As Adawan Haile Selassie, also a single mother looking after her own biological kids, offered to have me join her home. I was granted access to a better quality education and a trustworthy guardian, and so my mother did not have to worry. Fast forward, here I am, a daughter of a single mother from a town so tiny that my friends tease me for not finding it on the map. Forgive the vanity, but I'm not doing so badly. I've achieved quite some few things. When I was little, this is about 30-something years ago, I got to know what society and representatives of the state misname women like my mother to a setlage, which is a slur name given to their children. I got introduced to this name when my brother and I went to the district's governor who arrested my mother to beg him to release her. Knowing full well that due process is unthinkable for such random arrests, appealing to his discretion was a suggested alternative. Fantai hoped that when the governor sees us, he would have sympathy and release our mother on probation. Unsurprisingly, however, he said to us in Amharic, "Idukazi, get out of here, you children of an improper woman." We grew up knowing that Yaset Lijoch are children of those who do not have husbands and a father figure to step in moments of crisis. That we have failed in the business of normative family was an issue that the governor reminded us when we went to his office to plead for our mother's release. We were not afforded his sympathy because of the kind of woman she was. She was the wrong kind of woman who bore the wrong kind of children. The anxiety around Yaset Lijoch, as embodied by the local governor, has its parallel in Hortense Spiller's Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. Yaset Lijoch names a hierarchy of womanhood and female-led families based on sexual propriety. Some do not belong to both categories as recognized and advanced by heteropatriarchy. These mothers are expunged from respectable womanhood because instead of committing to monogamy, they form casual sexual relationships. There's nothing reputable in being any one of them, as their ways of living render men as guardians and breadwinners relevant. By virtue of not being married, these women were seen more like potential prostitutes, feared for being enemies of the normative family and its guardian, that's the state. And intimacy as practiced and lived by them is frowned upon by society and surveilled by the state, since both are programmed to understand only the grammar of monogamy. Failing to abide by the scripts of female respectability exiled my mothers from proper womanhood and their children illegitimate. However, their expulsion from the league became the very condition of possibility to engage in trade, own property, determine what to do with it, to raise their children as they see fit and live the freedom of mothering as an experience that's not gripped by patriarchy. It became a way for autonomy for the women to lead their lives on their own terms, of course, irrespective of challenges and struggles. They were going about life without attaching their self-worth with a strong male presence. And like the proper woman whose task is to give birth to an heir to inherit property, property ownership is crucial for these mothers as a means of creating possibilities for their children and making them active parts of social transformation. Some ran bars, others restaurants, others own stalls in weekly markets, some ran kiosks, others coffee houses, and so on. They are both the child bearers and the breadwinners who are not alienated from the fruits of their labor. In this sense, they are free from the lamentations about the family that marginalizes the woman from everything, including her own body. Like their counterparts in countries like Kenya and Nigeria, improper women in Ethiopia reorganized gender hierarchies of who could own and disperse property, to quote our Kenyan colleague Kegero Macharia. To these women, motherhood is thus not incompatible with property ownership, but rather a site of exercising economic freedom. While these mothers own private property, there's no property that's not shared amongst themselves, including children who are raised collectively, so much so that a woman is never childless because she can lay claim on any other child. That might be why every time I go back to my hometown, these women say, "Liji, nkwan dehna metash, welcome home, my child." Buzunesh, for example, never had a child of her own, but she was called mother by so many, including myself, who benefited from her love, care, wisdom, and generosity. This practice of facing the world as a collective would only make sense to me later in life when I hear my mother respond to compliments about my success, saying, "She is your daughter too. She's our daughter. What did I do alone? You raised her with me. She is Mariam's daughter." Even Saint Mary is invited into the mothering as a partaker in the process of raising children. Among Ethiopian Orthodox Christians, Saint Mary is crucial for mothers on the margin due to her imagined understanding of the pain and pleasure of mothering, given the tribulations she herself experienced. However, Yesithlij as a category is an anti-establishment. And this is dangerous in the eyes of the state, which has to manage the intimate life of citizens in the interest of dominant regimes of property ownership. So any semblance of freedom lived by an unmarried woman is almost always vulnerable to state violence. State violence might manifest in various ways, such as intimidation, imprisonment, imposition of unreasonable tax, confiscation of properties, demanding their children to be cannon fodders for the war machine. Let me give an example from my own upbringing. I grew up in the 1980s when Ethiopia was ravaged by civil war. It was also a time when the memory of the late 1970s notorious Red Terror was still fresh and part of everyday conversation. I lived through the war with my imaginations being fed by the narratives of the banality of violence, of the execution of young women and men in broad daylight. At the height of the civil war, the Ethiopian military government conducted an aggressive campaign to enlist soldiers. Young men above the age of 18 and even at times below were enlisted for national service, and there was no way anyone could refuse to send their children to war. It is unpatriotic, if not outright treason. As you can imagine, the pressure on unmarried mothers was higher because their children cannot name a father and are hence disposable. As part of this nationwide sacrifice for the regime, for example, my mother and a handful of her friends were asked to present their children to the altars of the state. The women refused, and they made sure the boys were nowhere to be found. They said to the so-called revolutionary guards, "Go get them if you can." As the government search continued, the women were sent to prison, where they had to be kept away for a few weeks. Now, this meant a socio-economic standstill. Due to their refusal to submit, the state also threatened to confiscate their hard-earned properties. I remember my mother's anxiety after one of the state functionaries threatened to take and convert her house into an office. And this was soon after they arrested her, and an act that already slowed her business down significantly. As if this were not enough, the women's labor was used to prepare food for the soldiers to be sent to the war front. Similar encounters with the state are found elsewhere on the continent around the same time. The Nigerian philosopher Nkiru Nzekwe gives an example of one of the biggest markets in Nigeria that was run by what she calls public mothers. In the 70s, the state eyed this lucrative business and wanted to control the revenue. Based on the women's struggle with the state, Nzekwe notes that the female devaluing patriarchal ideology of the post or neo-colonial state delivered the inbuilt outcome of female subordination. And she rightly argues that it's through the state repression that these women experience the suffocation of patriarchy firsthand. If the state came to dispossess the Nigerian public mothers of their assets, the state decided to encroach on their rights to guardianship of their children in the case of Ethiopian mothers. The states that promised to address the woman's question through the 1974 Ethiopian Socialist Revolution rather expropriated their time, resources, labor, and children. Their confrontation, once thrown out of the realm of respectability, is with a state that claims to have liberated these mothers from imperial feudal exploitation. Now, according to Nzekwe, the Nigerian public mothers drew on their naturally accepted status as mothers. She tells us that women in this context are regarded highly for the mere fact that they birthed humanity and have no reason to fear anyone, including the state. Drawing on this social recognition of motherhood, the Nigerian public mothers reclaimed their historic right over the market. But when it comes to Ethiopia, such claims cannot easily be made by all women, even if they were mothers. This is so because here, womanhood is not a natural category, but a product of specific socio-economic and historical relation. Because they are not conforming to the norms of family, the single mothers cannot make claims to the sacred motherhood. So they had to devise a different mechanism of struggle towards freedom and reclamation of their dignity. If they could not make claims based on the sacredness of motherhood, Martha Kwekumsa's Tumsa solidarity is at work to manage their collective lives and fend off state violence. The women's commitment to stick together by understanding their position in the society was a thing to rely on. Perhaps a case for Saidiya Hartman's revolution in minarchy can be made here. As Hartman puts it, these women might not have a written manifesto or party programs or may not organize big political events, but it is in the subtleties and apparent harmlessness of praxis of freedom that we find the revolutionary potential. For instance, when the officials arrested the single mothers for refusing conscription, other mothers such as Tasamash Nigatu, Asagadet Kudata, Hadabajiga, Hadatakasta, Buzunesh Mamu stepped in immediately. They took turns to feed us, while at the same time taking hot meals for my mother and the others in jail. The small children did not spend a single night without guardian until their mothers were released. If those imprisoned were accused of compromised patriotism, there was an equal risk involved for these women for their coalition with the enemies of the state. But the principle, it seems to me, that binds these women together is that of we are in this together and we are going to imagine and co-create possibilities for our children. Even when relationships are marred by conflict among these women, it happens as it happens most often, mothers always maintain relationships and visions for children. We're central in keeping those relationships. This commitment to Tumsa solidarity seems to be a tradition retained from the late 1970s Ethiopia. During the Red Terror, it was other mothers who used to take food for young prisoners because their biological parents would fear not to provoke any harm through their presence. And these other mothers were also crucial in helping the young men escape by hiding them in their homes. Many years later, I remember my mother reminiscing with some friends who survived execution and continued dreaming a better world from elsewhere. The other mothers that the state deemed inconsequential and less keen on political participation mobilized this nothingness to make life possible for young Ethiopians who had different visions. Akin to this, in her book on the political power of Black womanhood, Danny McLean asserts that mothers live for the we, and that already makes mothering a deeply political action that's performed by a collective. It makes mothering not an act of nurturing a sovereign individual, but a practice with shared aspirations for the plural. Far beyond an individual household, mothering extends to a community of care, of nurturing and cultivating humans who are prepared to face the world in a more realistic way. In this sense, collective mothering is a revolution in the everyday by those who believe in themselves, their children, and the future. It's a shared practice of instilling vigilance, pride, resilience, joy, love, and compassion. My telling of the story of the women whose lives big theories do not always illuminate, or who are buried in footnotes, or those who are used as case studies to try theories developed elsewhere, is a way of talking back to epistemic bullying. It's a refusal to being intelligible. It's an acknowledgement of their capacity to survive heteropatriarchy. It is an attempt to foreground their beautiful experiment in how to live, in how to live free, as Saidiya Hartman would say. This is a story of neither heroines nor victims, but ordinary women who lived life on their own terms in the social otherwise. Theirs is not a mothering that stems from an authentic African culture as an alternative to which we can look back for some wisdom. Thus, appeal to a pre-colonial authentic motherhood or womanhood might restore pride in one's matriarchal historical tradition, but does less in generating useful ideas in the march towards freedom, other than essentializing pre-colonial Africa as ideal space for, ideal space and time for women. So I refuse relativizing, romanticizing, and reifying motherhood in that sense. Rather, I foreground collective mothering as a repertoire of shared wisdom that opens up imaginations for emancipatory politics in anticipation of a better world other than the hyper-violent one in which we now live. Here, mothering means inventing or merging in a network of socially, culturally, economically, and historically specific ideas and practices to which we cannot ascribe essence. If my mother and her friends had any feminist sensibility, it's precisely the kind of bioma Lemeka describes as negofeminism, one that's located at the space where the immediacy of lived experience gives form to theory, allows the simultaneous gesture of theorizing and practice, theorizing practice and practicing theory, sorry. It's a praxis of freedom that concurrently involves doing and thinking. It operates on its own terms, having a life of its own, evolving, advancing, changing, as rooted in the socio-economic and political environment which produces and shapes it. Their feminist practices and ethics are not random, nor are they disconnected from what's going on at a national and international scale. Just like their womanhood, their feminist sensibilities are a product of particular socio-economic, historical, and political context. This means that if their exploitation does not necessarily trace its roots to African culture, as Western feminists would have us believe, their praxis of freedom takes shape within the specific condition of their subordination. Needless to say that these women turn the biologically deterministic notion of motherhood on its head, they problematize the idea of the nuclear family that seems to dominate the scenes of today's so-called African middle-class families. Also, they challenge the idea that motherhood is yet another institution that arrests women within the dictates of patriarchy. But I'm less interested in presenting their mothering as an evidence against these notions. Rather, I want to speculate. How do we think about the life of these women whose stories were not chronicled? How do we think about the lives of those who have not written a memoir, or for that matter, those whose lives were not worth a few pages of written something on their own terms? Or those who we cannot access in official archives, or if we did, only as subjects of academic speculation about what can be done to make their lives better. How do we give form, if we must, to these practices of freedom that do not conform with conventional feminist tenets? What can we learn from the lives that are not always translatable to mega theories? What possibilities become apparent when we pay attention to their practice or praxis in helping us think about freedom in the everyday? How can collective mothering inspire connections that allow humanity to effect social and political change that turns heteropatriarchy on its head? Obviously, I do not have an answer to any of these speculative questions, but I think answers can be found if we, distinguished researchers, step aside and let deliberation by mothers flourish. I live as I imagine the potentialities if improper women from today's Ethiopia, Kenya, Tunisia, Morocco, Nigeria, Algeria, Uganda, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Cameroon, Mali came together and developed a grammar of collective mothering through which regimes of exploitation can be thwarted and another kind of world imagined. I want to imagine these mothers hanging out with others elsewhere in the world, like in Asia, the Caribbean, the Americas, to debate what happens if this collective wisdom is brought together to think about social transformation. I like to speculate a world that has a place for mothers of a settled that doesn't force heteropatriarchy's notions of respectability. But I want to finish the talk with a quote from what June Jordan wrote in 1985 to pay tribute to her Jamaican mother. Jordan writes on the call to reminisce her mother's reaction to the arrival of washing machine to their house and the entailed reduction of workload. She writes, "But she did raise me to respect her way of offering love and to believe that hard work is often the irreducible factor for survival, not something to avoid. Her woman's work produced a reliable home base where I could pursue the privileges of books and music. Her woman's work invented the potential for a completely different kind of work for us, the next generation of Black women, huge rewarding hard work demanded by the huge new ambitions that her perfect confidence in us engendered. I felt once again the kindling heat of my hope that we, the daughters of these Black women, will honor their sacrifice by giving them thanks. We will undertake with pride every transcendent dream of freedom made possible by the humility of their love." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Debele. I really am very inspired, as I'm sure most of us are, by your talk today. Mostly because I'm sure that many of us also come from spaces where collective mothering is very much a reality. I mean, I can speak for myself in that I was definitely raised by formidable women around me, for the formidable mothers, might I add, around me. Because I think that it's quite important to note that in our neighborhoods, from a mother taking care of, or another mother taking care of you when you're not, or when your biological mother is not there, is part of the process of collective mothering. And I think that I really appreciated how you really showed how collective mothering is not only necessarily, I'd say, a continuous mode of resistance against heteropatriarchy, but it's also some sort of, it's an emancipation from it in other senses. Because I think that just to remove the patriarchal assumptions and also to subvert the patriarchal assumptions is very important. Because as you look at the I guess the unit of the collective mother, of the collective mothers, what comes across is that they too, what you call this, they display and they embody certain features that would only be attributed to a more, patriarchally aligned family system, or attributed to the role of men in the family, for example. You were speaking about how these mothers are played a huge intellectual role in your life, played quite a role of strength in your life as well. So I think that is quite important to really look at how your presentation of collective mothers really does push us further into subverting the patriarchal, order. I'm also quite interested in the point that you made around not necessarily treating these experiences of mothers as almost, as you mentioned, the whole, what tends to happen as academics is that we tend to also, subvert the role of mothers in our societies by treating them as what you call this, as something to be researched, or as footnotes, or whatever the case may be. And in that sense, we also seemingly there's a sense in which that also contributes to almost like a sidelining of mothers in that sense, or a sidelining of the role of mothers, of the what you call this? Sorry, I'm reading Dr. Divine Far's things at the same time, apologies. But yeah, it's also just making sure that we really try, sorry, let me just forget that thought, because I think it's gone. But nonetheless, I think that your point around just the mothers as embodied epistemology as well is quite important, as not just things to, figures to be studied, figures to be put in footnotes, but figures to also be included as figures that can speak to a certain way of being, a certain way of understanding the world, can actually contribute to an episteme of how we relate to each other as individuals. So I just thought those were just my initial thoughts on what you had to say. Of course, we can go straight to any questions, because mine was just a comment. But nonetheless, I can start with a couple of questions. If anybody has a question, you're welcome to raise your hand.
My questions are in the chat.
Okay, so I'll start off by reading Dr. Far's comment. He asks, if we didn't call them mothers, what would we call them, I assume? Because to be provocative, motherhood is the product or outcome of an entanglement with empire, a role well thought out to ensure the capital operates without disruption. Very important question. He adds, is this about personhood or motherhood, given the critique you have about heteronormativity? You can go ahead and address these questions as they come, that's okay.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, for the first one, if we didn't call them mothers, what would we have called? I don't know. Maybe we don't even need a category after all, to call them. So I wouldn't have an answer to that question. But because to be provocative, motherhood is a product of or outcome of entanglement with empire. I do agree with that. The second point as well, well thought out to ensure that capital operates without disruption. I agree with that, and I guess part of what I wanted to do was to show a different kind of motherhood that that disrupts, the notion of motherhood and the purpose, actually, not just the notion, the purpose of motherhood that's aligned to serving the interest of capital. Say, for example, in the idea of the family, in the role of the mother in there, what does she do? And when we look at these mothers, we look at property ownership, for example, and I didn't want to use the word capitalism and everything, but when I said they are anti-establishment, in a way, that's what I was trying to hint at, that they are anti-capitalist in the sense that they actually disrupt the notion of motherhood as capital wants it to be, and capital doesn't want them to, capital centers the male, more precisely the white cis man, and it revolves around him, and anything mothers do is in the service of capital, and the state also does the work of protecting the interest of capital by discouraging any other way of being a mother, like being my kind of mother, for example. So I think I just basically repeated myself in agreement with you, Divine, there, with you and your critique of motherhood as a project of empire and capital. And there's a need to think about other ways of mothering that disrupt this this notion. And do we need a category? I don't think we need a category, but how do we think also? Then I can't think of another way. How else can we make sense of, at least can we work with what's available to us by interrogating whatever is made available to us, and then by showing there is so many different ways of knowing and engaging that category that's made available to us. So if mothering or motherhood was, for example, understood exclusively from the point of view of what capital wants to do with a woman's body, then how else do we engage differently? So for now, I can't think of an alternative to categories, but I can think of what we can do with those categories to rid them of the essence and force and hegemonic power that they seem to have. And John, okay.
All right. No, I just thought that I think I relate with what you're saying, in the sense that you're providing an ameliorative understanding of motherhood, which perhaps by itself is it's ameliorative in the sense that it's opposing the capitalist assumptions of what motherhood would be, or this tie with motherhood, this tie that motherhood has traditionally had with empire as well. And I think that in that sense, it might just be, we might have to ask rather if the amelioration or the improvement of this category is in and of itself, is it an instantiation of a new way of mothering, or is it almost an instantiation of a different way of mothering? I guess that's also a question to pose to you, because I mean, of course, almost like this move away from these traditionalistic empire-based capitalistic understandings of motherhood can also be interpreted as a normative move, right? Or something as moving away from it can be interpreted as a normative movement to something perhaps better, something. So is that how you essentially want to conceptualize of this this understanding of motherhood that you're providing today?
I'm not sure I gathered everything, to be honest. Yeah, just like one line, give me a one-liner.
Of course, no worries. It was just that is this improvement is because it seems that this movement away from the capitalistic understandings of motherhood and these I guess heteropatriarchal understandings of motherhood, right, that you're making in giving us this understanding of collective motherhood as you presented it, might for some be understood as a normative move, as something that is moving from a better state of moving from one state to another state which is better of motherhood, right? So I'm just trying to understand whether you conceive of that move as as a normative move per se, do you even conceive that as a creation of a new category as a result? Because obviously it doesn't look like the mothering that Dr. Devine, for example, might be describing to us in the questions.
No, I wouldn't say. I'm always scared of being normative, perhaps because I really don't understand how that area works. So I wouldn't say an improved or a better way of mothering, or I wouldn't want to think about like offering an alternative mothering to this and that. I think I'm more interested in thinking about, I guess, so the so-called social otherwise. So I'm just saying this is not the only, I'm not saying this is better or bad. I think two things that I'd like to emphasize. One is that the hegemonic notion of mothering or motherhood as we are presented with is not enough. And it outshines everything else that exists as if it's the rule. So I'm critiquing that. And two, I am also arguing this motherhood that I'm presenting can be a point of departure to think of a different world. So their praxis actually can inspire a thought about the world differently. That's not heteronormative, that's not heteropatriarchal, that's not attached to or obsessed with the notion of respectability. We can even think about disrespectability as a productive side of thinking the otherwise. So better or worse, I wouldn't qualify it that way because I'm really not sure. But as a launching ground of a new imagination or a different kind of imagination, yes, and that it's not, and the normative family and the normative understanding of motherhood is not the only story we have. There are other ways of mothering and other ways of being in the world that are rendered illegitimate by the hegemonic discourse that need to be brought out so we can think differently about the world from a different angle, So that's really very humbly, that's what I wanted to kind of speculate or meditate, so to say.
So definitely a different worldview of mothering, essentially.
Yeah. So it's also, I guess perhaps one other point I'd like to make is it's also not a plea to go back to pre-colonial Africa where everything was rosy, because if we drag this woman that I spoke about to pre-colonial Africa in the way it's romanticized, they wouldn't have a space there, right? So because they are a product of a particular historical moment. And we can't just transport their stories, or we can't transport pre-colonial motherhood to their realities and try to understand as if they are exceptionally African, authentic, and all that.
Of course. Thank you. I'm just gonna take one question from the chat before we open the question to Sanya Osha. The question comes from Semene Asfar. They say, Serawit, thank you for that fascinating presentation. Can you elaborate how does the notion of collective mothering help us disrupt the unit of a nuclear family as a space of mothering? That's the question, thanks.
Okay, I guess, so the idea of the nuclear family, maybe if we talk about how capitalism rules every space. So it's the nuclear family is the zone of the couple, the heterosexual couple, right? And so everything is very private, and everything is focused on enabling this individual, self-sufficient individual, this sovereign abstract individual. And so it's a highly confining space. You're self-contained, and you are much less interested in the social, in the collective. So, but if we look at this collective mothering that I spoke about, that formed me, there is a way in which it disrupts this notion of mothering within the context. Let me give an example. So the typical family with a the heterosexual couple at the center has most times a nanny. So maximum interaction outside of the the mother-father category is an interaction with the nanny, and then very confined space of the school. It's not broadened. And I see this in Ethiopia, in Addis, for example, where I come from, and like there are families very much secluded from one another, and so everyone is minding their own business, which I'm not taking issue with that, but from the way I'm raising and my sensibilities, that's like a highly individualistic, capitalistic, and very confined way of living. And when we look at collective mothering, kind of disrupts, because it opens up the space to share ideas, to share imaginations, to share futures, to share resources, to share pains, and all of that. So that's how I see it when I say it's a critique of the nuclear normative heterosexual family.
Of course, thank you. Dr. Sanya Osha, do you still want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Oni. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I also want to thank Serawit for drawing attention to a very important, inspiring concept, collective mothering. And I was wondering, you touched on it a bit in your earlier, just your previous response to the previous question. The question of the possibilities for advancing the concept. I think it's a very important, it's an interesting concept for reimagining community, because the notion of community has become so destabilized. This means destabilized increasingly with the advent of the expansion of capital, global capital, for instance, and it's changing how communities are organized. We organize communities in virtual spaces now, in virtual communities. We have all kinds of communities, and so now I just wanted for you to think a bit about the challenges and possibilities for furthering the concept and advancing it, entrenching it in our everyday lives. Now, from the ideological perspective, from the institutional perspective, cultural, and yes, just social practices. What are the immediate challenges you see, and what possibilities do you see for advancing the concept? Thank you so much.
Okay, so the possibilities I see in advancing the concept, I guess, are looking into the literature that comes from Black feminism, specifically African American thinkers. I think to think with them and work with them and dig a bit further along those lines would be one possibility, in my view, at least from the small work that I did to kind of think through this presentation, has clearly indicated to me that there's a whole lot of parallel that can be drawn to further develop this notion of, collective mothering. I guess the challenge when it comes to specifically when it comes to Africa and African feminism, my observation, and I think including what I observe in Ethiopia, but I can't make general claims about this. But like the small observation I made is that there's a tendency to, like I said, to romanticize motherhood. And so it's always, there's a certain notion of understanding of motherhood, African motherhood, and it's always juxtaposed against whatever has been imposed on Africa. So whatever lies in between doesn't have a lot of room for speculation, a lot of room for, for digestion. So that I find a little unsettling, because we are producing another hegemonic discourse on mothering by, by saying, oh, there is this other mothering that's sacred, that's religious, that's matriarchal, and all that, and that used to be practiced before colonizers came, and then there is this. So I always have problems with that dichotomous understanding and juxtaposition of what has been brought from outside and what has been. Unless we go out of that confine and think outside, and that's why I find the literature by African Americans very productive, then that will be the challenge. But like I said, this is never something that I have been grappling with, because I think a lot about my mother, my own upbringing and all that. So this is a story that's personal and so dear to me, but I haven't really, thought about conceptualizing it and pushing the idea a bit further until the invitation came. And so I guess this will be something that I will have to take with me and continue thinking about, and hopefully we meet again and talk about this. But yeah.
Right. Thank you. I think in the interest of time, I just have one more question from Shirley Mendez before we close off. The question goes as follows. There are currently many discussions going on about care politics, care ethics, in the sense of pointing out how care work burdens women and needs to be accounted for as women's effective economic contribution, especially mothers, but that it constitutes work that patriarchy names as natural and done out of love. These discussions within an anti-capitalist feminism have entered Latin America, including Brazil. And I would like to hear from you about this issue, about how this kind of theorizing needs to be addressed in African contexts, because it seems to me that, again, the Western episteme separates the private and public spheres, as well as economic work, as well as the economy work, and effectively love amongst other categories.
I think so. I think Shirley's question kind of captures my own frustration. I think that's what I was speaking to when I said, okay, I guess I don't know the literature on Brazil, but in Latin America, but that's part of what I wanted to kind of hint at or indicate when I said, the literature coming from Africa seems to be caught in responding to, so it's much less about what's going on and how we can think about that, but it's about responding to what has been imposed. And so when do we make time to, to think about and problematize the politics of care and what capital does, there in the name of care, in the name of self-care, in the name of care for the others, what else is going on, what underlies all this, widely held new, fashion about care, and how do we account for women's labor? on the continent. And I don't know if there's a lot of discussion, but I seem not to see much. And I'd be grateful if Shirley, you have anything to recommend that I should see, or maybe if we should think together about this and see what we can do.
I see that Dr. Fa has one more question. I'm sure it might be quick and then we can end off. He asks, what about the critique, especially from scholars such as Amaduime, Oyeronke, and others, that Africa and African women are as well an anomaly in the theorizing of the African diaspora?
Where is it? I don't see. I want to read.
Oh, it's in the chat. I'll ask it again. That's okay.
No, I'd like to read.
Okay, you'd like to read it, sure.
Yes, that's a problem. Okay. Yeah, I see it. Okay. What about the critics, especially from scholars such as Amaduime or Oyeronke and others, that Africa and African women are as well an anomaly in the theorizing of the African diaspora? African women are, I guess not only Amaduime and Oyeronke. I see a lot of this also from in Zekwe's. I was listening to a talk recently about this actually, and how how African women are the anomaly in theorizing of the African diaspora, and I think I disagree with that. Or there's a particular notion of African woman that is, imagined as an anomaly, because I find a lot of parallels about African women, or my understanding of African women, or the experiences I have. I find a lot of parallel in the theorizing of the African diaspora. Like, for example, when I read Saadia Hartman, I read a lot of my mother's story. And that's not, so in my view, that would be not anomaly, but like a lot of parallels to be drawn from these experiences. So I have a lot of misgiving about that critique. Divine. Yeah. And
Sure.
yeah.
All right. Well, I guess we are just at the nick of 5 p.m. Here in South Africa. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I think it's been an absolutely amazing talk. And particularly, I'd like to thank you again, Dr. Debele, for giving us a new insight into sorry. Actually, if you're okay with it, Azza just would like to ask a quick question. We might just, I think if you have extra time.
I do.
Of course, okay. Just one more question from Azza. Go ahead, Azza.
Yeah, thank you, Serawit, for that. I mean, I think I just like to listen and then probably ask at the end, like this question that pop up in my head. Yes, I mean, I like at the beginning when you started your talk about the attribution, to the collective motherhood and mothering. And I was thinking, yes, I mean, the success is attributed to our mothers, the mothers who are in our lives. But also, there is also this tendency of also attributing the non-success, to the mothers. They will tell you, okay, they were not brought up well, and this bringing up is also associated to mothers. And I would like to ask you, this concept of collective mothering, would it disrupt that notion of also collective bad mothering, or I don't know how to also call it?
I don't want to make the collective mothers responsible for a child going wrong. Yeah, but really, it also goes back to the question of what constitutes bad mothering, by whose standard. And I think we have the answer from divine. Blame the fathers or the non-fathers.
Okay.
because I'm not prepared. Thank you, divine, actually. Yeah. So
yeah, exactly. But probably
true,
blame
but
the
I guess
patriarchal of the society. Yeah.
I guess most times the blaming the notion itself comes from, there is no much expectation of how you will eventually turn up, because you are brought up by a woman who doesn't have a father figure to protect the family and all that. So I just want to theorize, or I'm not theorizing. Think about or the notion of disrespectability as a different way of thinking about how we can exist. That's not always comfortable for patriarchy and heteronormativity. So it's always expected. Nobody expected that my mother would raise a child, a female, a girl child. That's that, and that child will become me. So, and then there's always, the assumption and expectation that these mothers will fail, right? And I just refuse that. And yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now you can close Olerato.
Thank you. Of course, I'll never miss the opportunity to have the discourse and discussion going. However, we are out of time. Again, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Debele, for this interesting talk. And I think that you've really just given us a new insight into mothering. I think that before this talk, I was very intrigued as to what is
going to say.
what is it going to be about, really? But I think that you gave us a very good and thorough presentation of the multiple imaginations that we can have about what collective mothering looks like and what it can do for the world, and I guess for everything rather generally. Nonetheless, thank you again, everyone, for joining. Tomorrow we have another seminar. This is it's a humor interdisciplinary seminar. Is part of the humor interdisciplinary seminar series, and will be delivered by Tapua Guza, and is titled Black-Skinned Europeans: A Journey Towards Cultural Esteem and Identity Rehabilitation on the Continent through Art and Food Interventions. Thank you again for joining, everyone. I will conclude the session at this moment. Thank you.
Okay.